I'm so excited because this is our very first episode of getting to know some of our team members. So I have Dr. Carolyn Strong with us today, and she is a new team member for us as far as full-time staff, but she's been part of our ecosystem for quite a while. And I'll have Carolyn introduce herself a little bit, and then we'll talk about what we're going to be discussing today. So Carolyn, would you like to tell the audience here who you are, what makes you awesome, and a little bit about your backstory?
I can definitely tell you who I am. Now, the what makes me awesome part, I cannot attest to. But as you said, my name is Carolyn Strong, and I am an educator in the Chicagoland area with about 2 decades, well, a little over 2 decades now, over 2 decades of experience in, I guess, what we would call marginalized communities, communities of color. My particular area of expertise is discipline, bridging discipline gaps, things of that nature. So that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much. And I'm just excited, number one, to have you on our team. We've been talking about the possibility of this for a while, but it's just great to have you with us. And it's even more great to bring in some additional perspectives and to have some people on the team who are from Chicagoland, which is where I spent most of my career. So I'm just really excited to have you with us. Now,
Well,
I know
thank
one of the
you.
things we actually met through restorative practices, and that
Yes.
was kind of our start of the conversation. And I know you just mentioned that you do a lot of work with the discipline gap, which we all know is rooted in biases that people hold and what they expect
Absolutely.
from different groups, right? But another thing that has really been a topic of conversation and something that I believe you're pretty passionate about, and when I speak to your strengths, I will say this is one of your strengths, is speaking truth to things that people might not want to hear about. And one
Oh,
of
yeah.
those pieces is the idea of curriculum and what's covered in our curriculum and what's not covered in our curriculum, and how our
Absolutely.
curriculum can actually perpetuate harm, right? And to put
Absolutely.
it in a nice little package, we call it curriculum violence. So, can you
Yes.
tell us a little bit more about what that means to you and why this is such a pertinent topic for you to discuss?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things about curriculum violence, and let's just go back for a second. The term, I mean, the concept obviously has been around forever, but the term was coined in 2010. That was when we first started to see the actual term curriculum violence show up in literature and things of that nature. And one of the things that those of us that do this work in this field have kind of been pushing back on, even with that original term, is that when you look at the definition, the original definition of curriculum violence, it surrounded intent. So originally, when the term was first kind of put out there, the original definition of curriculum violence was intentional harm caused by curriculum. And as we in this field already know, intent does not always equal impact. So one of the things that a lot of us that specifically hone in on curriculum violence try to do is dispel that misnomer that something has to be intentional in order to be harmful. So the
Mhm.
way we're looking at curriculum violence now is curriculum that is presented in a way, whether intentional or unintentional, that causes harm to those it is meant to service and or educate.
Absolutely. And I know when we're talking about this, a lot of our clients are in the education space. And I also had many years in the education realm. And a lot of my work was in curriculum design and instructional development. And we would often look at curriculum. And one of the kind of questions that we get is, as teachers, if we're utilizing textbooks or readers, how do we acknowledge the harm that we're not even putting into the material, but we are expected to teach that? So I'm wondering what some of your thoughts are around that, of when a district has adopted resources or has text or materials that they're asking their teachers to utilize, but that curriculum is very one-sided, which does cause harm.
Well, I think, well,
We're
you
going to
know
dive
me,
right in,
we are,
Carolyn.
Me, but I'm shy. I think that this is twofold. And you know me, I love a good acronym. So one of the things that I often tell, I have two acronyms that kind of break this thing down. One is taking curriculum violence to task. And when you're taking curriculum violence to task, that is for this particular scenario where you have a teacher that has been given a curriculum and this is what they are being asked to teach. And what we are now asking this teacher to do is to utilize this curriculum, but do so in a way that does the least amount of harm possible, but still keeps them safe because again, you still got to work here. And one of the things about this work is that I'm never asking anyone to do anything that is going to cost them their livelihood. Like I would never do that. So when we're doing these things, we're asking people to do them in a way that is safe, but still with fidelity to what it is that we're doing. And so with task, what you're doing is you're thoroughly examining the lesson at hand. If we're breaking it down lesson by lesson. And then we're asking questions of the lesson that undermine the narrative of a single story, because that's typically where the issue comes in, is that this curriculum is being formed in this silo with this very single story view of what's happening. And then you're seeking honest, inclusive alternatives if it comes to that. Now, of course, you can't just throw the curriculum to the wayside, but what you can do is introduce additional materials. And then you keep reevaluating and adjusting as necessary. So when you're taking curriculum violence to task, you're thoroughly examining, you're asking questions, you're seeking honest, inclusive alternatives, and you're going to keep reevaluating. So it's kind of like my teaching background is in English. So and there are many ways to do this. And when you're looking for alternatives, there's also ways of framing that. For example, when I am teaching Jekyll and Hyde in say Britlit, and we're reading Jekyll and Hyde, we're looking at Jekyll and Hyde. Now we're introducing, say, Mary Riley, because that is a different point of view for the same story. Am I now taking the original source material and throwing it to the wayside? No, I'm not doing that. But what I am doing is introducing an alternative so that we are not viewing this lesson through the single story of Jekyll and Hyde. So then you would introduce that different perspective. It's the same thing with this. Because
Right.
let's be honest, once we know better, we have a duty and responsibility as humans, or once we know better, we have a duty and responsibility as humans to do better. So once we recognize that something is harmful, how do we now mitigate its harm for those that we are charged to protect?
Absolutely. And that's a great example. And I think what I'm thinking of as you're speaking to this is some of the literature that's still being taught in many of our schools without that either pre teaching or another perspective or other materials to balance that out. And I'll just say this is more of a personal example, but my son is in high school, and one of the books that they're reading is To Kill a Mockingbird. And I struggle because I'm asking questions like, what are you doing to pre teach before you have the students read the book? How are you bringing in multiple perspectives? How are you teaching this? What is the purpose of the lesson? And I'm curious around, there's been many books that some schools have chosen to take off their list, and other schools have said, no, we're going to continue. And I'm curious as to how your stance is on some of those school districts who have either taken books off their list or have just said, teachers, teach what you teach. This is what you've taught forever. Go for it.
This is where I struggle also. And part of the reason that I struggle is because as an English teacher, for good, bad, or indifferent, for some reason, I don't know if it's encoded in our DNA or what, but English teachers get so stuck in the canons. And one of my best friends is a reading instructor. And this is a point of contention, obviously friendly contention for us, because, reading specialists are like, I don't care what you're reading as long as you're reading. And then those of us in ELA are like, no, it's got to go like this. It's the canon. It's world lit, then it's American lit, then it's Brit lit, and then this is what it is. So I struggle for that same reason, because To Kill a Mockingbird is canon. It's canon American
Mhm.
lit. So the equity advocate in me wants to say, yeah, no. But the ELA trained person in me goes, but it's canon and we can't get rid of it. So how do I now become this symbiote where now we are sticking to the canon, but doing it in a way that is responsible and nonviolent? So
Mhm.
it goes back to those questions that you were asking, because you're gonna have a hard time getting To Kill a Mockingbird out of American lit. Like, it's
Mhm.
just it's still there, and the book was written. How old is Harper Lee now? Um, and it's still there. So what we now have to look at is, if it's not going anywhere, what can we do to make sure that we are keeping students safe when we're doing this? How
Mhm.
do we teach this book in a way that has meaning, and we're not doing
Mhm.
it just for the sake of doing it? How do we tie it? I mean, what happened in that book could have happened yesterday, and probably did somewhere. Let's
Right.
just be honest about it. And so, how are we teaching these things in a way that we're being responsible? And if we're taking the time to do that, it has impact, which is a different acronym that we'll probably talk about later. So, how do we pre teach? What do we pre teach? What types of conversations are we having? What types of literature are we looking at? Are we looking at the laws on the books of the time when this happened? Are we taking the time to truly look at the fact that, for all intents and purposes, Atticus Finch was a co-conspirator? He didn't think he was, but by our definition of those of us that do this work now, he absolutely was. Because a
Mhm.
co-conspirator is somebody that does what? Puts everything on the line to be the advocate that this person needs. And nobody
Mhm.
else in that city was willing to take that case. And Atticus said, I'll do it, not because I'm trying to be at the forefront of civil rights, but because it's the right thing
Right.
to do. So,
Right.
how much are we looking at that? How are we framing this? Are we laying the groundwork? Are we offering alternative assignments to the students that don't feel safe? This material can be triggering for some. Are we offering alternatives to those that feel triggered by this? Are we acknowledging how and why it can be triggering? Are we doing the work that needs to be done to shore up the safety in that classroom when we open this box?
Right. And I think that piece right there of how are we prepping our students is critical. However, before we figure out how we're going to prep our students, we need to make sure that we know how to prep our teachers and our staff.
Mhm.
Because I will say that in many of the conversations, when we're working with our clients, when we're having conversations around curriculum and around lesson planning, teachers are saying, that's great. And I would love to do that, but I don't know how to do it. And with such a polarizing culture that we live in right now, people are afraid of saying or doing the wrong, quote unquote, thing. Right. And they're afraid of doing what could cause harm because let's face it, I don't think anyone purposely does things with the intention of causing harm. They're doing things because they believe it's what's best for them based on their lived experiences. So,
Mhm.
how can we help teachers understand what that looks like and how they can come to terms with their own biases and their own thought processes and give them the tools they need to be able to do this work so that ultimately, because all of us as educators are here to serve our students, so that we can serve our students?
Well, I think that um, you may not or may not know this, but sometimes I say the quiet part out loud. And I think that in this case, this is work that our teachers should be doing anyway.
Mhm.
Um, I have said time and time again that as an administrator, I would much rather read a lesson reflection than I would or lesson plan. So,
Mhm.
regardless of who it is that you service or who it is that as an educator you are in service to, you owe it to yourself as a professional and them as a constituent to be reflective about the information that you put forth for public consumption. So, taking that into consideration, I think that again, we need to be teaching our teachers or modeling for our teachers how to be reflective, how to step outside of ourselves, how to walk this line of we understand that we as living, breathing humans are the sum total of our experiences. That's something that we'll never get away from. But at that same time, we are also doing this with the understanding that while you are the sum total of your experiences, you need to navigate in a way so that does not dominate and imprint and permeate on the students that you service. So while it guides who you are and it guides what you do, it cannot overtake them. And that's where
Yeah.
that reflection piece comes in. And that's where we have to constantly stop and step back. It's like an artist, right? They don't just sit there and paint the whole thing and then step back and look at it. At least
Right.
most of the artists I know don't. They do a little bit and then they step back and they go, hmm. And then they go back in and they step back again and they go, hmm. And they adjust as necessary. I have always been of the belief that teaching is way more art than science. And in that, it's
Mhm.
an art, which is why a lot of parents found out firsthand it wasn't as easy as they thought it was during the pandemic. And so,
Exactly.
in that artistry, you have to stop, back up, take a look, turn it to the side. How's it look this way? How's it look that way? Okay, maybe needs a little more blue over here. I mean, it's the same thing with teaching. And without
Mhm.
that reflection that is ongoing and authentic and honest, which may or may not include having some of these conversations. But before we even get to the more targeted conversations, from day one, we need to be teaching our teachers to be reflective, which is why
Mm.
I've kind of been on the yeah, lesson plans, yeah, no bandwagon for a while. Let's talk about lesson reflections. Of course, you need an outline. So I am a proponent of lesson outline, lesson reflection. So you have an outline of what you want to do, but now I would rather you spend more time on the back end figuring out
Mhm.
how it went and adjusting as necessary for next time. So that may be a roundabout way of answering your question, but we can't do this without putting in that reflective work. We can't do
Right.
this without asking those hard questions, whether it be of ourselves or if we're teaching collaboratively or in small learning communities or PLCs. I know the words and lingo keeps changing, but whatever those small learning communities are, the cooperatives and things, those need to be very reflective communities that are asking questions and holding each other accountable for the answers and holding each other for changing and adapting as necessary to service the students honestly and with fidelity.
Absolutely. And, even as our name shares of understand self and then unite society, it's about understanding your own role in the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another thing that we've really started talking about even more, especially since the results of the election, are how the curriculum in our schools might be impacted or will be impacted, the predicted outcome of what's going to happen with curriculum in our schools. Do you have any insights or thoughts around what you think might happen and or how staff can prepare for that?
Insight, I wish. Thoughts, yes, plenty. I think that honestly, we really don't know what's coming. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know what's coming, and we don't know how it is going to impact us moving forward. I think that if some of these things do come to pass, it's going to kind of, I apologize, it's going to kind of push everything into the hands of the states, at
Mm-hmm.
which time things will change and it will become a state to state issue. And because of
Mm-hmm.
that, the way things are taught is going to very much operate in this silo of red and blue.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, as far as educators go, I honestly do not have a cohesive answer for that right now because it's
Mm-hmm.
just way too early to say. And we could sit here and say, you have to push back, you have to do these things, but that may not be possible for everybody.
Right.
There are some states that already have kind of this banned list of things that you can say or do, and your job is on the line if you don't follow it. So
Right.
I think that right now, all any of us can do is to keep doing the work that we've been doing and see what happens and then pivot once we know. Because, yes,
Right.
there are some things we can predict and kind of get ahead of, other things, not so much.
One thing I do think that everyone can start doing now, and this would have been regardless of who won the election, but really making sure that there are multiple perspectives brought in to every
Yes.
concept that's taught, especially in our
Yes.
history courses as well as our ELA courses. It's about how do we ensure that everyone's voices are included in that conversation and not just through the classroom discussion, which is critical and very important, but also through literature and making sure that we have examples of different literature from different people of different identities. Because again, our identities are formed through our lived experiences, and the ways that we approach the work is impacted by our lived experiences. And
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a dominant or submissive component of who we are, every single piece of who we are determines how we see the world around us. And I think
Absolutely.
as educators working with our children deserve to see as many perspectives as possible so that they can really understand not just their own viewpoint, but viewpoints of others.
Well, I think, too, just to kind of add to that, I think that depending upon what grade level we're talking about, um, the introduction of multiple perspectives is not just helping them understand their viewpoint, but it's helping them to shape their viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we come here, we are not fully formed in who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Our experiences and our input dictates that, right? Our input dictates the output that we have as adults. And part of the and they are still in their input stages. And so offering those multiple perspectives gives them yet another opportunity to glean and or understand where it is they truly fit in this world intersectionally.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, we base the work we do on statistics and data and research, but we
Mm-hmm.
don't necessarily speak on all of those pieces. But one statistic and one piece of research that we often share in our work, especially with educators, speaking to what you just shared, is up until the age of 12 is when children are really internalizing and creating those synapses to form their first thoughts or their implicit bias. And then after the age of 12, it's about developing our core beliefs, right? So we talk about our implicit biases or our first thoughts are learned by our behaviors, by our outside environments. They're usually taught to us, maybe not explicitly taught to us, but we are experiencing different things. What we see on TV, what we don't see on TV, what we read about in school, what we don't read about in school. all of those things are impacting what we believe the world is about. And then after the age of 12, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, is when our synapses are formed. But after the age of 12, we have the ability to shape our core beliefs and what we want to see happen in the world and how we want to move forward to hopefully be change makers, which is how we see the world, to be proactive in ensuring that everyone is seen, heard, welcomed, and valued instead of consistently being reactive, which our country has really gone through that pendulum of, we see a stark increase of these types of efforts after a significant event,
Yes.
right? It's very reactionary. But the truth is that none of the things that have happened over the last 4 to 6 years are new. It's
No.
just that they've become more publicized or put into the forefront so people believe they're new if they've never seen it before.
Right.
And that's part of the issue, is we need to be able to talk about this more openly so that people acknowledge that the killing of people of color has been happening since forever, right?
Yeah.
And we need to talk about that more regularly so it doesn't seem like a rare occurrence when it does happen, like the murder of George Floyd, and an increase of over 600% of positions focused on DEI being brought into both corporate and the education realm within the first 6 months after his death.
Yeah. I agree.
600%.
Yeah. And even in 2 points to the things that you just said, I think that in addition to the things that are taught to children overtly, we need to also be mindful of the things that they learn tacitly. I think the other piece of that too is that there is privilege, there's that word again, in being able to believe that these things are new, that goes
Mm.
highly unacknowledged at times, because
Mm-hmm.
those of us in marginalized communities are well aware that marginalized bodies have been sacrificed for a long time for people to prove a point. The first human to die in the Revolutionary War was Crispus Attucks, a black man. So um the things that are happening with George, that happened with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and people of that nature are nowhere near new. But the
Right.
fact that there are people that honestly and truly believe that being only 60 years removed from the civil rights movement, and we still act like these are brand new things that just popped up in the last 10 years. There is a certain amount of privilege that goes into being able to believe that with any amount of fidelity that we don't talk about.
Exactly. Exactly.
Honestly, the biggest part of the change, specifically with regard to curriculum violence, and I'm actually really happy to see this, is that we are getting to a point now that, as I've often heard you say, um, people are no longer able to use intent as an excuse for bad behavior. I think for me, when we're talking about CV or curriculum violence, that is the biggest change, is that we're
Mm-hmm.
no longer saying, well, since that's not the intention, we won't change it, or we're
Right.
not categorizing it as curriculum violence because it wasn't meant to be harmful. So we're now acknowledging the fact that intent and impact are sometimes mutually exclusive as it relates to curriculum, which is something that wasn't happening before. And it was just kind of being used as a way to kind of dismiss the harm of some things that people just didn't want to change. We're still seeing a lot of that with regard to the way some things are taught, some things that are most often talked about. We see that a lot with Thanksgiving and Columbus Day. We now
Mm.
know historically that they have been taught inaccurately. We now know that some of the things with regard to how we've been teaching children that those things happened just was not the case. And yet, I think that we've probably known that, would you say maybe the last 20, 25 years with fidelity? I mean, it's always been suspected, it's always been hinted at
Right.
that, how far did Columbus overshoot the West Indies? Like, this is what you were looking for, um, and things of that nature. But we have been so slow to remove those things from the curriculum. There are still children talking about the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. I think those are the names of the ships.
Hmm.
And we know these things now to be inaccurate.
Hmm.
And so I think that that also has been a needle move with CV, is that they've now also said when you know better, you have a duty and responsibility to do better. Because at this point,
Right.
when you don't, you are knowingly and willingly assisting in the proliferation of information that you know to be false. And
Hmm.
also, I think too, sometimes we kind of look at things through this lens. And when we talk about curriculum violence and harm, we often only view it through this lens of race. And that
Mm.
is not the only way that curriculum can be
Hmm.
harmful. It's one of the ways, and it's kind of the one we talk about the most because it's the one that's easiest to see. But
Right.
there are so many other ways that curriculum can be violent. There are so many other things that touch on the marginalization. For example, um, I did some work once with the school that had a pretty high population of either students that were in foster care or weren't living with their natural parent. And this was information that was known to the school. The social worker would come and let the teachers know, so that if there were issues of a social emotional nature, they would know that this may feed into that. There, because of the fostering nature, there were some transient populations that would come in, you know. So basically, the social worker had done a really good job of laying the framework for these are the things you can expect, which you think, okay, look at the school being proactive, right? That doesn't happen very often. But then, in juxtaposition to that, you had this one teacher who had decided that her family tree assignment was the hill that she was not leaving year after year after year,
Mm.
knowing that your population, that there was a double digit population of students who may or may not have access to this information, who
Hmm.
getting this information may be harmful to, trying to relay this information, or just even reliving the fact that they don't know the answers to these questions. Yet she was unwilling to offer alternative assignments. She was unwilling to give, to allow any passes. And that's the thing. That had nothing to do with race, but it was still very, very harmful.
And that's a great example of some of the pieces that we talk about with it's not just around race. Here at Us Squared, we have 15 different identities that we talk about specifically
Right.
and we talk through. And that's not a mutually exclusive list. The ideas are that we need to open up the conversation. And when I asked the question about what do you think has changed over the last 15 years, and you said the idea of intentions not necessarily being equivalent to impact and really kind of isolating those two and separating those two out. Another piece that I think has been critical, not just around curriculum violence, but just around these conversations, is people are starting to lean into the conversation even when they're uncomfortable about it. There are still a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
pushing back against it. However, there are enough people and enough companies and enough school systems who are saying, okay, we need to at least have the conversation. It might be uncomfortable. We might not like it, but we need to at least have the conversation. And one of the things
Mm-hmm.
I talk about in my book is that we cannot heal what we do not reveal. And the very first step to doing anything is we have to look behind the curtain. We have to look at what's
Yes.
actually happening behind everyone's lived experiences and what's happening in our society around us. There is no bubble that it is not impacting. So, how are we going to be able to help our children to not grow up in a bubble so that it doesn't get popped or burst, but it just isn't there to begin with? How can we expose them to different experiences and different analogies and different thought processes? And that's really critical. So I'm so glad that we had the opportunity to have this conversation. And in closing us out today, Carolyn, I would love to hear, why did you decide to join our team, and what are you hoping to accomplish as a part of the US² team?
Well, I think the biggest reason that I decided to join your team is that for me, I have been doing the work tangentially for so long. I have been doing this work while I was still in K-12 and still doing other things. And I think that I have done pretty well in terms of being able to do the work while still doing that. But a big thing for me was, imagine what you can do when you let that part go. So and you get to focus on the work solely. And so that was a big part of it for me. Plus, this is no secret to you, I've admired your work for years, and
Hmm.
I have just been kind of looking for an opportunity to present itself for me to be a part of it.
That means a lot. Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's very humbling to have a group of people who truly want to do this work. And that is extremely humbling for me, to have such a great community of people surrounding us and to be able to do this work and truly live out my passion and allow others to live their passion as well. One thing that I can say about every single member of our team is passion is first and foremost. And there is at least one topic that everyone on our team can talk for hours about. And most of those topics relate to the DEI space or the social justice space, in some facet. And that is really the purpose for these conversations, is so that the rest of the world can see some of the brilliance that lives within our team, and to really shine that spotlight on our team. So thank you so much for being a part of it. Carolyn, thank you again for joining me today. And we wish
Thank
everyone a
you.
wonderful, wonderful day.